you can access the drawing tools from the database or after you make a recording when you're viewing a record. So we'll go ahead and jump to that stage now. Open up a record here. You can see that this is of a runner on a treadmill here. Play it back in slow motion. We've got him set up with a marker set here with reflective markers, and for those that are joining, you likely have either our 9aux cameras or at least the myoVIDEO system, and so you may be familiar with using those reflective markers. And you can set them up in a few different combinations, but typically, you know, for something like running or gait, you're usually going to use about 8 markers or so, 7 to 8 markers. And so, for instance, you can see here on the sagittal plane, we have one at the hip, knee, the ankle, and then I decided to put one as the sort of flat part or the sole of the shoe, as opposed to just going directly to that 5th metatarsal. You'll see why I did that here in a second. On the posterior view, we've got them set up a little bit tight here, but essentially to represent the PSIS there, give us a nice straight line to look at some pelvic drop. But we could have also used some other markers to fix into other positions depending on what it is that you want to see. You know, maybe you want to see frontal plane movement at the foot, so you want to see something at the heel placed on the marker there. Maybe you want to look at torso sway back and forth. That's an option too. So you can get creative with these, and then I'm going to show you in just a second how to use some of the different drawing tools and what's available to you so that there's a little bit better understanding of how to use them. So we'll go ahead and stop the video, and typically when you're applying drawings, you want to start from the first frame or the 0 frame. One thing that you can also do is if you even begin your videos perhaps with the person stationary, you can ensure that they're in the same position even every time, and that's always going to help for a better marker tracking experience, just in case there's, you know, you want to use some of the layouts, which we'll talk about here in a second. So these drawing tools are going to be shown from the right side toolbar under video analysis. So we'll select that. And you can see here, there's a number of options that we can work with. Some of them providing simple just annotation of the video, maybe just tracking of a marker. This one in distance provides some options for looking at the distance between 2 markers, whether it's the distance actually between them or even like the horizontal or vertical distance. We've got 2 marker angle chains looking at 2 markers as a line with reference to a vertical or a horizontal line. A 3 marker angle chain, typically used in this case like for knee flexion. So having a point of rotation in between 2 other markers. A 4 marker angle chain allowing for a reference line to be established, and then looking at the angle deviation of another line or connected points. Maybe even just a simple crosshair to place onto the video and look at, you know, the pattern of somebody navigating outside of a vertical space or you know, a certain horizontal space. And then these last 2, these are going to be some specific options, but for instance, the cycle track allows for, or circle track rather, allows for the tracking of a pedal stroke on a bike fit. And so you could potentially use one of the foot markers to understand, you know, where in that stroke the individual is, and use that signal as part of a reporting mechanism to line up the different images or some of the data that you might use in a bike fit, for instance. And then the force plate, for those of you that have force plates, this is utilized to provide a force vector overlay. So you can draw on the video and demonstrate where the force plate might exist in that video frame. And then using the data from that force plate, we can illustrate the force vector on the video frame itself. For today's how-to, we are going to focus mostly on using the drawing tools up here. just to give you an understanding of each one of them that exists, and we can start to play around with them. So first, what I'm going to get into is just a simple 2-marker angle chain, and we're going to use it on this posterior video frame here. So again, starting from the 0 point of the recording, the very beginning, and if you ever need to change your cursor directly to 0, you can also always click in here and just type in 0 and hit enter, and it'll bring you right to that point in the recording. So we'll start with the 2-marker angle chain. So when we want to initiate any of these actions, we just click on the button, and then you just want to follow the directions provided in the right side toolbar here. So we want to click on 2 points. And certainly if you ever have any further questions while you're using these things, you can always click the online help menu, and it's going to give you some information about the different tools or the options that are available to you when doing video analysis or any utilization of some of the MR3 operations in the software. So we want to click on 2 points. You can go right to left or left to right. Essentially, the first point is going to be your axis of rotation or your fulcrum point. So we'll click that, and you can see here how when I move this the second marker around, that's what's actually creating the angle. Whoops, got a little trigger happy there. We'll redo that one. So I'll go left to right here, and we can connect these 2 markers. And then when we finish that next click, it gives us some options to set some settings. So in this case, we're going to call this pelvic drop. You can always type in here any other name that you'd like. For instance, let's just say hip drop on this one. And then if you've had other options that you've saved in here, you'll have a list as well. So if there's frequent angles that you create in a posterior view, for instance, or using, the 2D marker tool, you can have that list be populated down here. The next options are some simple stuff. You can change the color. If you double click on this, you can change the color of the drawing. You can decide whether or not you want to show the label. So that's an option too. You can change the polarity. So if it's a positive or negative angle at that particular point. So essentially changing that where that measurement is stemming from. And then there's some options for changing some advanced positions, such as where the anatomical 0 exists. This one's important for the 2D angle because typically you want to measure deviation from a true horizontal line or from a true vertical line. And that's going to be represented by these 90-degree and 180-degree options here. So you'll see as I make some of these changes, if you ever want to see how they adjust, you can always click preview and see what happens. So in that case, all I did was remove the show label. But if I wanted to change the polarity, for instance, you can see how that makes an adjustment. Or if I wanted to make a little bit more drastic change and have it be referenced from a vertical line instead of a horizontal, I can choose 180 and click preview. So that's always helpful to do as you're going through and figuring out these drawings. Of course, as you start using this and determining what drawings you actually want to provide on certain analyses that you might be completing, it really is just that first part of effort to get it set up, and then these things will be accessible to you going forward. Once that's established though, you can click OK and it'll save that drawing in the frame here. And real quick, in terms of zooming, you can always use a mouse wheel if you've got a wireless mouse or a connected mouse. You can even use your trackpad on a laptop, and if you take 2 fingers and kind of move your 2 fingers up and down on the trackpad, you can zoom in as well. That's always going to be helpful when you're actually, laying the drawings down onto the markers to really zoom in and get right in those center points. So from a posterior view, we really don't have much else that we want to evaluate. You can always move things like this. You can put the value in a certain spot that makes it a little bit easier to read. In the sagittal plane view, as we start making more drawings, you'll see how those can get a little cluttered. So moving on, we'll start to look at some other types of drawings. Let's first take a look at the distance here. So this one's interesting because it does allow you to calculate distance between two markers. And of course, you know, with any of these tools, you can track them through the recording. But what's different about the distance tool is you do have to establish a reference distance. So while the instructions tell you to click 2 points, you'll see that the next step after this is actually defining that reference distance. So what I want to do for this one, and what sometimes is often, you know, utilized in a what I hear utilized in some of these, you know, clinical exams of running is maybe understanding, you know, where the knee is positioned over the toe. So we'll click 2 points starting at the knee here, and then we can drop it down to this heel, this marker on the heel. Again, we've got our options to set things up. So we can establish a body side. We can give it a particular name, KOT, knee over toe. Of course, we can do color schemes as well. We can choose to show the label as we saw before. And then using the distance, there's a couple different options for here. So we've got first a 2D distance, which is essentially measuring the true distance between the two markers, you know, with reference to the line that's established. Or you've got options to get the other parts of the triangle, if you will. So the horizontal distance or the vertical distance. For this one, we want to look at the horizontal distance because we want to see the left-right position of this marker relative to this heel marker. So we'll go ahead and click that. And again, if you ever want to make any changes, you can always do that and click preview to see how it makes an adjustment on the actual frame at that point. One thing that's nice too is you can always zoom in and out still while you're working in the settings here. So we'll go ahead and click OK and have that be saved. And we'll start working through a couple other drawings. Our next one that we're going to look at would be another 2 marker angle chain. And this is an example of how to use this in the sagittal plane for hip flexion, which is oftentimes registered as the orientation of the thigh segment relative to a vertical line. So we'll go ahead and click 2 marker angle. Again, we want the fulcrum to be at the hip, so we're going to use that as our first click. And then the second click is going to be down to this marker on the knee. You can see here that we have our pelvic drop saved from our previous 2 marker angle chain. So again, that's just demonstrating how if you make some drawings and you use it with these tools, they'll be available in a list for you to use. This one is sided, so we're going to click left side here, and then we'll call it hip flexion. We'll give it a different color just to spice things up a little bit. And I'm going to keep the label on for this one. And then this is, again, where we would want to understand how we're actually measuring hip flexion. So in this case right now, it's measuring the deviation from this horizontal line. So that 90-degree line is considered 0. We want to look at it relative to a straight line. And so if we can do 180, we can see if that gives us what we're looking for, which in this case is exactly what we wanted to see. So 0 would be straight coming down. You can see sort of the angle deviation right here. And we want to have hip flexion be represented as a positive value. So as it deviates away from that true vertical, we get that measured in a positive angular value here. If we were to choose something like 0, for instance, you can see how this changes it. So it's looking at the opposite side of that measurement. You know, you could even change the polarity on that and it would be just registered the opposite from there. So in general, though, 180 is going to be the option that you would want to choose for at least this 2 marker angle chain here when you're looking to compare to a vertical line. So we'll go ahead and save that and we'll keep moving along. We'll do a 3 marker angle chain now to represent our knee flexion. And so in this one, as the name states, of course, you need 2 or 3 markers. So we'll go ahead and in this case, you know, as with the 2 marker angle chain and even the distance where the first click was representing our fulcrum point, with the 3 marker angle chain, the fulcrum is actually in the middle. So we're going to start from the top and go down in this case. And we'll connect it right here on the lateral malleolus there. So again, we want to establish some settings here. We have it left, we'll call it flexion. And then this is where we can also, again, play with how knee flexion is defined for us. And of course, you know, everybody is going to have their own conventions of what they want to use, which is why we provide these options in general for people to make those adjustments based off of what they want to see. In this one, I want knee flexion to be positive, so I'm going to go ahead and change the polarity there, and you can see that now it changes the adjustment of how it's measured. With 3 marker angle chains, what's interesting is you can have this continuation. So you can continue the chain whereby you then make this 3rd marker actually the fulcrum of another 3 marker angle chain. Oftentimes that can be used, you know, to look at ankle flexion, if you will. But you do have to be careful if that's one of the things that you do, because if you just immediately continue and you go right to this 5th metatarsal marker, you can see that it's already got an offset. So an interesting thing to do there is to use a different type of the axis. It's hard to set up, but I'll go ahead and try and give you guys an example of how that would work. So we'll continue this chain, you know, making that second 3 marker angle chain from the knee marker to the ankle marker to the 5th met. But again, what we want to try to do is define a different anatomical 0. So something that's offset from these horizontal or pure vertical lines here. And so in this case, you would type in a particular degree amount, and I'm just going to arbitrarily throw this in here because I actually don't know what the value should be, but you can hit 45 degrees and see how that makes an adjustment on the measurement. You can try, you know, negatives in here as well. So negative 45 degrees. So you can see the difference there. Using this other option for defining the anatomical 0 is very helpful in this situation, but it's also not necessary. And the reason being, and this is what I'll get into for our next angle chain, which is the 4 marker angle chain, is you can use that to define a reference line with the tibia here, and then the deviation of the sole of the foot to give us that ankle flexion. One reason that this is difficult is because you often have to track the measurement first to define, you know, where that 0 actually is located. So keep that in mind if you ever try and give that a go. So we'll go ahead and click cancel on this one because we don't want to continue it. So let me redo that 3 marker angle chain for the knee. So again, starting at the top, going down here and connecting at the ankle. You could, of course, also just go right here and get a knee flexion angle, but you'll see how there's a slight deviation between the value when it's here at 176 and here when it's at, you know, roughly 173. So be careful with that if you are going to make that distinction, because you do want to, you know, be as detailed as possible when you place these markers. And so for this one, since we don't want to continue the chain, we're going to go ahead and click finish. But first, I want to make sure that we've got the right measurement. So now that's a value for us. And then finally, we're going to do this 4 marker angle chain here. And this is going to allow us, as I mentioned previously, to define a reference line and then define the measurement line. So as you can see, the instructions are to click 4 points. The first one being that reference line, which will make the shank segment here. And then the second one being that measurement line. Again, your first click being your fulcrum axis of the measurement. So we'll click here, and then our second click, or our 4th click, I suppose, would be at this fifth metatarsal. This one can get a little tricky just in terms of what you have set up for the measurement settings. So you want to be sure that the value that you're putting down the anatomical zero axis that you're putting down is appropriate. You can always edit those properties if you do click OK and it doesn't turn out to be what you want to see. In this particular case, this looks good to me, so I'll keep this. But if you ever need to access those properties again, you can always either double click on any of the drawings, or you can select them and hit properties down below. So just to give you an example of some of the other options, we do have the text, which I mentioned, allows you to simply just annotate the video. So maybe there's something in particular that you want to indicate on one of the frames of the video and use that as a still frame in your report. Or perhaps maybe you just wanted to point out something, and use that as a way to indicate a marker and also have the ability to track it. So in this case, you can see I just placed it on the hip marker, and then it gives me a line that I can essentially place wherever I want on the frame and make a note about that marker, that position, or whatever it may be. Before we get into tracking, I do want to also mention the reference line, because we did use that distance marker, if you remember from earlier, and so we were looking at that knee over toe distance. Right now it's shown to us as a percentage value, and that's with reference to this line here that appears on the video at this point. What you do with this is then take this line and position it somewhere in the same, essentially the same distance or same depth as the subject, and you want to define that as a certain value. Right now, for instance, as you can see, it's set at 100%, but if I right click on this, I can hit properties, and now I can define this reference line however I wish. So maybe we call this, 8 inches. And again, we can hit apply to see how that not only changes the reference line, but then it also changes our distance measurement here in orange. It's important to pick a reference line or an object that's in the same depth away from the camera, because of the rules of perspective, and closer things to the camera are going to appear larger than they actually are. So you want to choose something that's more or less in that same depth in order to get an accurate representation of that distance measurement. We'll go ahead and click OK on this and keep rolling with the tracking. So that's the next step in this journey, is after we've made our drawings, and of course you can make as many as you'd like. Certainly I've taken a lot more time to set them up than they actually do if you're just going through the operations instead of explaining all the steps. And the other thing that's really neat is we have the ability to actually save these configurations. And so if this is the drawings that you're always going to be applying on your on your sagittal plane videos, you can go ahead and save that, and you can title it as a certain configuration and then have that be accessible to you over and over and over again. And so at that point, you actually don't have to redraw anything. You just have to load the configuration, and then it'll have those drawings automatically appear. There's times where you may have to make some slight minor adjustments, but you don't have to go through all of the labeling or the axis definitions or anything like that. Let me put the hip flexion angle on here real quick, and then I'll actually do that so I can show you everybody what that looks like. So we're going to do hip flexion, which I think we must have deleted on accident, and click OK. So if I save, we're going to call this left side. As you can see, I've got a couple already on there. Left side running, and click OK. Now, if I were to have started this this drawing with everything deleted, in fact, I'll just go ahead and delete them all. I can hit load down here, and I can select my configuration, left side running, and click OK. And you can see that it just automatically applies those drawings. Again, there's a situation where you may have to slightly adjust something, but look at how simple that was. It was just dragging a quick, from this marker to that marker, as opposed to redrawing every single one of the illustrations that you've got on here. So the next step in the phase would be to track these markers. And so with, it selected again from 0, or even the very front end of the recording with some of that negative time, you can hit track, and it'll capture or follow these markers throughout the recording such that you have data to actually work with in this 2D context. So depending on how many drawings you have, as well as the length of the video and some things like resolution and frame rate, the tracking can take a few seconds. But once it's complete, then you've got the ability to play this back, and you can see how it's actually following through, on the sagittal plane video. As you saw, I did not track the posterior video yet. So we actually lost our pelvic drop marker because it simply just appeared for a couple seconds as a still frame drawing and then went away. So let's go ahead and track that real quick. And then you'll be able to see that with the 2 video views that we're able to track both of those. So now we've got this showing in the video. Again, this is something that you've got the control to be able to move these things around. So if you want to position these values, in certain places, you can put that near the ankle. We can put that near the hip. This can be in front of the knee, for instance. So you've got the ability to start to move those around as you see fit and what makes sense for your analysis. But you also have access to trackable data now. So for instance, here's our knee over toe value, which creates a nice little sinusoidal wave for us to use as data. Additionally, we've got all of our video-based angles shown here. So we've got our knee flexion angle, we've got our ankle dorsiflexion angle, hip flexion, pelvic drop on this side. These are all now signals that you can utilize in a report to understand how this person is moving, or to even relate to other signals that you might be collecting, whether it's EMG, and you want to look at muscle firing patterns in relation to the 2D kinematics, or in this case, we've got the instrumented treadmill involved, and so we've got our force signals that we could even use to look at the relationship between the force and the kinematics. The next step, of course, after making tracking some drawings and getting data, would be running that report. And so there's obviously a couple options, a couple ways of doing that. The first and primary video analysis option that we've got is by using what we call points of interest. And those are established by these orange markers here, and of course these big orange button in the corner that says add to report. So wherever you have your cursor positioned on the timeline, which you can see I'm scrolling back and forth, you can click add to report, and it's essentially going to take a snapshot of the video frame and whatever other animations you might have going on, so the treadmill in this case. And then that's going to be accessible to you in a point of interest report or any of your other reports that might have point of interest elements involved. So I've already got 3 defined for this particular example. We've got initial contact, mid stance, and toe off. And of course, you're able to actually label those markers under the marker menu here. So we can, say flight, for instance, as an extra one. So when I add that and I'm in that marker menu, again, wherever I have my cursor positioned, if I have this selected and I hit add to report, now it lays it down as the flight marker as opposed to just being a normal standard marker name. But regardless, this is once you have those laid down for a couple of the different points of interest that you'd like, and of course you can use as many of them as you want. You can then run that report, and so we'll go ahead and look at an example of that real quick, and then I'll show you a couple other reports that do a little bit more of an automatic tracking using some point of interest options. So we'll go under myoVIDEO reports, and I'll use this running POI report that I made that has some particular settings. Here, just follow the same process as you're generating reports. We'll go ahead and just use our auto tracked values and our force value in this case. Click next, and then it's going to pull data from those three markers that I laid down, and it said add to report. And so again, gives us the image that we're seeing, as well as some data from that particular point in time. And of course, you can also use these to add notes. So every point of interest can have its own set of unique notes, as you can see here. And to edit those, you simply would just double click on this report element, and you can make a change to the comment section here. Just as any of our other reports, you've got the ability to change the layouts, for instance. In this case, you can just change what pictures are even shown. You can change where the comments are even positioned, what the font sizes are. You can even change what statistics are being utilized in certain cases. And you can go through those settings to make that adjustment depending on what it is that you want to see. So this is more of an example of a more manual point of interest report. So something that has, you have to click on the specific points and you have to say add to report. But we also have some options built in that are a little bit more automatic, and you can actually set auto point of interest markers based off of some different signals. Whether it's the actual kinematic signals that you have from the drawings, or if you have access to something like the instrumented treadmill or force plates or something like that, you can use the phases defined from those reports to actually establish some nice points of interest as well. So an example of this would be some of the other reports that are available in the myoVIDEO section. So this is a POI running report. So it's actually using the data from the pressure treadmill, which defines the stance and the swing phase for us, but then it's going to call out the images the same way that we saw in that previous point of interest report. And I'll show you how it's doing that. So we go ahead and select this report and click OK. Again, we can decide what values we want to push through. We'll go ahead and add some angles in here too, so that we've got everything. And then when you click next, for some of you that have this system, you might be familiar with the fact that it automatically defines the stance and swing phase. Otherwise, we just keep going through if we don't want to make any changes. And now it's going to automatically separate and position these pictures so that we can see it's taking those initial pictures. Let's go ahead and get some data from a different perspective here. Sorry about that. It grabs the images from the first phases, and as you can see, we started our drawings at 0 and not at the negative time point here. So in this case, we now have our track drawings and the data that's associated with it for those different time points. The nice thing about this report is it demonstrates this particular activity in a nice dynamic context, gives you some options to enter in comments, and it's a very illustrative report for this, which automatically segments out the different phases of the run here. How this works is it's actually using the different events. So the previous report, we actually were just using the marked positions, so those manual marked positions. But you'll see here that there's options to do it by a threshold of a particular channel or by certain period phases. And so you can make that adjustment. depending on what it is that you want to see. So in this case, it's 90% of the stance phase, and it's named terminal stance. So these are all options that you've got available to you to start to play around with some of the different point of interest reporting scenarios, which of course can be utilized, with the myoVIDEO drawing tools if you want a nice illustrative report example.